Thank you, Will, and thank you, Atlantic Council, for inviting me here. But I'm going to take a step back before I talk about Syria. As many of you know, for 6 years up until August, I was in the think tank World 2, right down the road at the Washington Institute. And one of the benefits of being in a think tank is that you get to think about the larger issues of foreign policy and a broad sectoral analysis. And so, having been bitten by that bug, which you aren't really too exposed to when you're in the Foreign Service, I still try to follow up on my interests, even in my current job, which is pretty all-consuming. So I saw an article the other day, I don't know, it was in the Times, New York Times or the Washington Post, about how America, once again, not that we ever weren't, is divided on various schools of thought on foreign policy, whether it should be isolationist or neo-isolationist, or, you know, to use Kissinger's two definitions in diplomacy, realist or idealist, internationalist, kind of blame America. You know, there are various flavors that you can use. But based upon what I'm doing with Syria, I realized that there was something missing. To all these analyses, at least as described in this article, of people weighing the pluses and the minuses of these things, they ignored, which is a bit unusual for an article on foreign affairs, the rest of the world. The rest of the world and how it acts gets to have a say in how we respond, assuming we want to respond as the most powerful nation in the world to events around us. We can respond to those events and respond effectively. I've certainly seen it. You've all have seen it. But we cannot really, I'm sorry, shape or determine these. We have to take the world pretty much as it is. We can tinker at the edges, but at our very best tinkering period in the 1990s, how many of you here want to stand up and say, boy, we changed the world fundamentally for the better in that period of time when we had all the power in the world? So you see the problem we have now, because now the world is different. And the Trump administration has grasped this with both hands, both in many of its policies, but also in its doctrine. The national security strategy, quote, in its introduction says, authoritarian states are eager to replace the United States, where the United States withdraws our diplomats and closes our outposts. The national defense strategy goes on to say that interstate strategic competition, not terrorism, is now the primary concern in U.S. national security. It goes on. It is increasingly clear that China and Russia want to shape a world consistent with their authoritarian model. Again and again, at least in the introductory parts of these two documents, and you're all experts, you know that that's the part to look at, because the rest of it is just a laundry list of every single program we do anywhere in the world, regardless of which administration is writing it. But the upfront elements really signal where the administration is coming from, and this administration is has come to the conclusion that interstate rivalry with near-peer competitors is really, really important, and we have to deal with it. That gets to Syria. In terms of an internal conflict of the sort that we have known and basically been focused on for the last almost 30 years, since the fall of the wall and the end of the Gulf War, Syria is almost in a class by itself. You all know the figures. You talked about them earlier today. Over 500,000 men, women, and children killed. The largest humanitarian crisis, I believe, in the world since World War II. Over 11 million people. That's more than the total of all of the inhabitants of New York City and Chicago, driven from their homes. Half of Syria's pre-war population. The rise of ISIS as a manifestation of this malignancy. The waves of refugees that have destabilized, I would say, the entire political system in Europe to a degree that we have yet to see the end of. This is all the internal aspects of this conflict. But this conflict has also become a great power conflict. Right now, there are 5 outside armed forces inside Syria, along with the Syrian military, to the extent we can still call the Syrian military, and that is the American, the Russian, the Turkish, the Iranian, and in the air, the Israeli. and they're each pursuing important national security objectives, which in a couple of cases, certainly in the case of the Turks and the Israelis as neighboring states, they would see as existential. And so any policy that focuses on the situation in Syria cannot simply focus on the internal conflict. It also can't ignore it because it's crucial. But the two feed on each other. But as we go forward, we have to focus not just on getting this group to take that action vis-a-vis the government, to either lay down arms or take up arms or that kind of thing, which we've been doing off and on for the last 11 years. We have to focus on the international diplomacy because that is crucial for any outcome. The U.S. has three goals in Syria. First is the enduring defeat of ISIS. We're well on the way to seeing that happen. The problem is ISIS will come back if the underlying conditions are receptive to that kind of ideological movement, and that requires us to deal with the other two. Not only to keep ISIS from coming back, but because, again, in the world of great power and regional competition, they're very important. First is the 2254 UN process, which I'll get into in considerably more detail, on a changed regime in Damascus that doesn't drive half its population away after killing roughly 3% of the population, killing and maiming over 3% of the population, and hasn't opened the door to all of these other horrors, plus a major escalation of Russian military involvement in the Middle East, which is not, does not portend for more stability in that region. So we want to see a regime that is fundamentally different. It's not regime change. We're not trying to get rid of Assad. We just want to see a regime, again, that does not produce the kind of horrors that we have seen. Finally, we think that Iran has to get out of there. When we say Iran, we're talking about Iranian ground troops. Iran will have diplomatic influence in Syria. It has had it for many decades. It will have more now because of the relative change in power of the Assad regime versus Iran. But Iranian troops, and particularly Iranian long-range power projection capabilities, missiles, rockets, air defense systems to protect them. They're a threat right now to Israel, which is why Israel conducts strikes against them. But they're potentially a threat to us, to our allies and partners such as Jordan and Turkey. So that's the policy. In doing this, once again, a lot of the focus, particularly in the last week with the contretemps with the Turks over the northeast, we've looked at individual areas. Al-Tanf and the Rukban camp down there, and our back and forth with the regime and the Russians on refugee, IDP relief convoys from the UN out of Damascus, pressures along the border of Al-Tanf by the regime. We've seen a variety of military engagements, including one in the last few days. Then the Northeast, our relations with the PYD in the fight against ISIS, vis-a-vis the Turks and their concerns about the PYD's ties to the PKK and their threats to come in militarily, as they have done twice before, in the north of the country in Euphrates Shield, and then later in Afrin at the beginning of this year. So, and then, of course, there's the Idlib ceasefire agreement, which is holding more or less between the Turks and the Russians, with the Iranians having come in later, but all kinds of conditions that are hard for the Turks to meet, such as clearing the main M4, M5 road and getting all of the hardcore terrorists from mainly, but not only Hayat Tahrir al-Sham, back from the deconfliction zone, and eventually, according to the sort of the understandings related to the Idlib agreement, basically getting rid of that organization physically in one or another way. But more generally, what we have for the first time is, other than along the Merv, where the final fight against ISIS is being carried out, relative peace and relative calm throughout all of Syria. There are some shellings in Idlib. There's shooting back and forth between the Turks and the Kurds along the border and around Manbij. And as I said, there was an incident in Al-Tanf. But compared to what normally was the fare that this conflict has dished up since 2011, it is relatively peaceful. We believe that this allows a brief opportunity for diplomacy to work. In looking at diplomacy, we see UN Resolution 2254 as the road forward. That resolution, entitled Endorsing Roadmap for Peace Process in Syria, was unanimously adopted almost 3 years ago to the day on December 18th, 2015. It presents pragmatic steps in a path to peace in Syria for all Syrians, a de-escalation in violence across the country, unhindered humanitarian access, and the convening of UN negotiations to draft a new constitution and hold free and fair elections. The reason that it's unanimous is that its principle is there is no military solution. Now, occasionally, or not occasionally, all of the time, we think that the regime believes in a military solution, but the regime doesn't have the military power to effect that. It has to rely on essentially infantry provided by the Iranians and air power provided by the Russians. And they have other interests, and we thus think that there is an opportunity to move forward on the political track. Right now, most of the attention, and this week will be the denouement of it, so to speak, has been with the Astana process and the Sochi agreement, again, of a year ago, where the Astana Three, that is Turkey, Iran, and Russia, brought together originally to negotiate deconfliction zones, agreed with some support from the U.S. and from the UN to take on the job of calling forth a constitutional committee to execute the first of 4 major tracks in the political process. That is, to draft either a revised or a new constitution. That has been in fits and starts moving forward for the last year. We're very close to a potential breakthrough or a breakdown this week. We'll find out by Thursday at the UN Security Council meeting on Syria, where Staffan de Mistura, the UN envoy, set up, well, he was actually there before 2254, but 2254 reinforced his role, will pronounce the verdict on this Astana effort. The foreign ministers of the 3 countries are going to meet with de Mistura tomorrow in Geneva. They're already talking at the sub-minister level to figure out if the list that they have put together meets the standards of the UN for a credible list of people that represent truly the opposition, the government, and civil society, basically neutral people. The Turks and the Russians have told us that they do meet that criteria. The opposition, headed by the Syria negotiating committee, has declared that right now they do not accept the list. That's a huge problem for de Mistura. He has to decide and report back to the Secretary General. So all this is happening as we're talking here right now. We believe that there is a chance that we can see a breakthrough with the Constitutional Committee called forth in early January, because the list will be accepted by the UN and by, frankly, all of us. But right now, we're not there. And the question, which has been the question throughout this entire negotiation on the Constitutional Committee and on all of the other efforts dating back to 2012 to try to resolve this conflict, is the regime willing to give an iota of compromise to any effort by the international community to try to resolve this on terms other than the regime's, because the international community is not going to resolve it on terms favorable to the regime unless it has to, and it doesn't have to. The regime has not won this conflict. Over 40% of the territory is in other people's hands. There's over 100,000, counting the PYD, over 100,000 armed opposition forces in the country, still active. The areas where the Assad regime rules, again, have only 50% of the population. It's largely rubble because of the way that the Iranians, and particularly the Russians, carried out actions in the cities against opposition. And it will require, depending upon the estimate, $300 to $400 billion to rebuild. Who's going to pay that bill? After Lebanon was torn apart by Hezbollah's attacking across the border into Israel in 2006, I'll tell you who paid the bill, because I was involved in it. It was North America, Western Europe and the international financial institutions largely funded and supported by us. That is, we paid the bill for something that an Iranian surrogate launched. That's not going to happen again. There's a strong readiness on the part of Western nations not to ante up money for that disaster unless we have some kind of idea that the government is ready to compromise and thus not create yet another horror in the years ahead. So those are the pressure points that we have to try to push, if not the Assad regime, then at least the Russians and the Iranians forward. We're not asking for regime change. We're not asking for the Russians to leave. What we're asking for is a compromise settlement. We'll see if we get it. In terms of the Constitutional Committee, the question is, how will this committee work? Who will be in charge of it? Again, Stefan de Mistura, who will be leaving this week on the 20th, has come up with, we think, reasonable ways forward of ensuring that this is a Syrian-led process. Once again, he has to fend off efforts by the regime to, for example, have this Constitutional Committee meet in Damascus, to have it under the shadow of the Astana Group, whose interests are not the same as that of the international community. Those are the things that we're basically going back and forth on, again, as we're speaking here today. The commitment to move forward on this was strongly reinforced in Istanbul at the end of October in a meeting of the presidents of Russia, Turkey, and France, and the Chancellor of Germany to press on two areas of concern to everybody in Syria. First is Idlib, in part because of the 3.5 million people who were there and the fear that they would have no place to go if there was a major offensive, thus to support to quote the document that came out of Istanbul, lasting ceasefire in Idlib. And the second thing is to convene the Constitutional Committee by the end of December. Well, we're almost at the end of December, so we'll see what happens in the days ahead. Now, two scenarios. Scenario A is we do get this Constitutional Committee. This will have a strong effect on, if you will, politicizing and diplomatizing the conflict. We already have, as I said, a de facto ceasefire, a set of ceasefires around the country. But in every area, they're different. We have an agreement with the Turks on Manbij. The Turks and the Russians have an agreement on Idlib. We have no agreement with anybody on Al-Tamf, and on and on and on. What we're trying to do is to move that, again, in the direction of the path forward laid out in 2254. 2254, because it's what we've been focusing on for 3 years, talks a lot about the political process, but it also talks a lot about de-escalation. De-escalation, and this was something that President Trump emphasized in his various comments on Syria up in New York, because he believes very much in this. De-escalation is absolutely necessary to support the political process. The political process, in turn, if you get progress on it, such as convening the Constitutional Committee, will support de-escalation, because the more you have a viable political process, the harder it is for any of the actors to violate it by launching yet another offensive. So, both in a political, logical sense, moving forward on the Constitutional Committee is important for the maintenance of these ceasefires and thus for relative peace in Syria. But it also opens the door to paragraphs 5, 6, and 7 of 2254, which talks in detail about a set of ceasefires managed or monitored by the UN, ultimately for a nationwide ceasefire. We think that's a good idea. We want to move forward on that. We're working with various of our friends. We've talked with the Russians about this. We don't have a lot of agreement so far, but we think that it's the logical next step, again, using 2254 as the overall roadmap for a resolution of this conflict. When I talk to people about this, sometimes with some people their eyes glaze over, because we've seen so many initiatives, we've seen so many efforts to try to end this conflict, and it just rolls on and on. Well, first of all, we're at a point now where it's no longer a conflict between part of the population and the government. It's, to a significant degree now, pulled in outside powers. It's a different kind of conflict. It also is no longer involving active fighting. That could change tomorrow, but for the moment we have an opportunity. Finally, there is the question. If the bulk of the Arab world, Europe, the United States, and international agencies and organizations hold the line and say, without following 2254, we are not going to provide support for the Assad regime. What is the Assad regime going to do? How is it going to win back the other half of its population? Certainly, Assad is no advertisement for coming home. How is it going to gain the territory? And most importantly, how is it going to rebuild its devastated infrastructure and cities? That's the question that we pose not to the Assad regime, because we don't talk to them, but we pose to the Russians all the time. We're still waiting for an answer. I'll stop there, and I'll be happy to take questions.